Read One Communications presents The Scholar's Chair. This program is brought to you in celebration of 1400 years of Islam's contribution to spiritual and intellectual development.
And without rationality, how can we communicate consciously knowledge to ourselves and to others? How can we conduct our lives in harmony with this understanding? And almost all traditional understandings of the reason principle, or the intelligent, knowing, perceptive part of the human, have linked it to the fountain of all being, the source of consciousness and awareness. And in Islam, there was a peculiarly rich development of ideas concerning human intelligence as a gift from the divine, as a basic trait of the inborn human constitution, and as the basis of possible synergy between God, the Creator, and His creatures, both as an inborn faculty and as an organ of access to transcendent reality. So what I'd like to do today, in a little bit less than an hour, is give you an overview of the Muslim understanding of reason, and concentrate in particular on a famous hadith, a prophetic tradition or a narrated report concerning the creation of the inborn human faculty of intelligence, and trace it out over 1,000 years or more with a few highlighted events and personalities, and use it as a window into Muslim thinking about reason and intelligence. Of course, it's very selective and very concise and very inadequate, but it might give you a little bit of appreciation to the depth of the thought involved. The Quran uses the root aqala to understand, comprehend, grasp, intelligize a number of times. It's not an insignificant term, but it always employs it verbally, never as a nominative. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, if you would but comprehend, if you would only understand. It's a kind of a refrain that is a sort of admonishment. Why don't you understand? And it is a remonstrance as well as a form of persuasion. It's an appeal to the human mind and person to exercise the innate faculty of intelligence and draw consequences and understand the import and the implications of revelation, of guidance. So as the Quran complains at the end of many passages, بَلْ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا تَعْقِلُونَ, but most of them don't understand. Summun, bukmun, deaf, dumb, they're like beasts. You have to yell at the animal and make him turn left or right. And so it likens humans to people of a beast-like quality who don't exercise their faculty of intelligence. If you look on the handout, Early Utterances on Human Intelligence, page 3, you get a famous Quranic verse, وَقَالُوا لَوْ كُنَّا نَسْمَعُ وَنَعْقِلُوا مَا كُنَّا فِي أَصْحَابِ السَّعِيرِ. And they would say, had we but heeded, listened, audited divine revelation, or understood, exercised our faculty of perceiving, knowing, we would not now be burning in hell. This is the lament of the disbelievers in hell. So we have an interesting association there of the notion of audition, hearing, and perceiving, knowing, understanding. This is a very ancient association. The Sumerian symbol for wisdom was an ear. Remember what Jesus would tell his disciples? For those who have ears to hear. And even one of them said after one of his sayings, that is a hard hearing. It's difficult to understand. There seems to be an intimate relationship between the faculty of hearing and the faculty of comprehending. And this is an essential feature of intelligence. So parallel to the phrase أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, if you would but comprehend, is the phrase أَفَلَا تَسْمَعُونَ, if you would but hear, audit, heed, and act on it. And other parallel phrases, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ, ponder, يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, reflect. And we see that in the Quran, therefore, the concept of intelligence, innate reason, is linked in this semantic field with several other critical faculties of perception and comprehension, which together form a kind of structure. Intelligence is linked with reflection and active use of one's critical, perceptive, and comprehending faculties. It leads to faith, iman, and produces certainty, yaqeen. And that is a characteristic of the highest class of humans who were referred to as ulul albab, those possessed of heart-mind understanding. So there is a hierarchy involved. Not only is there a hierarchy of human comprehending faculties, but there's a hierarchy of the knowers who exercise those faculties. This is implicit in the Quran, but there's no doubt that it's there. Of course, the Quranic data was amplified and expanded by old Arab wisdom teachings. The Quran did not erase what was present. It refined and reformed it and channeled it. The ancient Arabs were well known for their wisdom sayings. Didn't Solomon say that his wisdom was greater than the Bani Qidam, the sons of the East? He meant the Proto-Arab tribes in the desert, who were famous for their proverbial wisdom. So we have a whole class of early utterances, aqwad, sayings, statements, sometimes attributed to famous sages before Islam or early Muslim individuals who were known to have a certain proclivity for uttering these type of statements. And the notion of intelligence or understanding features prominently in these. The study and analysis of this material is very important to understand the trajectories that unfolded out of the Quranic teaching, because the Quranic teaching was intermingled and supported by existing indigenous elements in the society among the Arabs. So aql, reason, intelligence, was contrasted with humq, stupidity, imbecile, how should you say, someone who's blockheaded, who doesn't draw lessons from experience, for example, who repeats his mistakes. Another antonym is jahl, folly, ignorance. So in the old Arab system, the aqil, the man who restrains himself and acts wisely, is contrasted with the jahil, who is like a barbarian who is full of aggressive and impetuous response. By the way, the term aql is unique to Arabic, and there is no cognate parallel in any other Northwest Semitic language. That's quite significant. Many common terms can be paralleled in Hebrew, Ethiopic, South Arabian, even Ugaritic and Babylonian, but not the term aql. And it comes from a object, concrete object, which is part of daily life among the old Arabs. They had a thick woolen cord which they used to hobble their camel. In the desert, you don't have many trees around to tie your camel. You lift one of the hind legs, you fold it at the knee, and you slip this doubled cord over the joint of the folded knee, and the camel is left standing on three legs, so it can graze for a few hundred meters in the vicinity where it's left, but it won't go away. So if you come back in several days, it'll still be there, right? That's how you tie your camel. You restrain it. So when they're not in use on the camel, that cord is folded twice and placed on top of the head to keep the head cloth in place. It's called al-iqal, hobbling cord. So the image is the beast is restrained. And so the folly and ignorance and barbaric reaction of the unreformed man is restrained. And that makes man wise or smart or intelligent. That's the core, concrete, semantic derivation of the term intelligence, reason in Islam. Of course, the significance of the fact that humans wore it on top of their head might go along with the fact that it reflects the highest faculty in the human person, but there's no explicit mention of that in the sources. But it seems to me rather obvious. You see it today if you see Arabs wearing a headcloth, you always notice that woolen rope around their head. So we have a number of sayings that show that intelligence was considered integral to faith. In other words, faith has a cognitive dimension leading to the higher realms of certainty and cognitive perception. There are mottos which have been cast in the form of prophetic hadith. لا دين لمن لا عقل له. There is no faith, no religion for one who is lacking in intelligence. Or الكيس من دان نفسه وعمل لما بعد الموت. The wise man is the person who deals with himself, reforms himself, and works for what is in the hereafter, not for a goal which is worldly. So this is a kind of Quranic reformation of the old understanding of wisdom, where the sage works for what is best in his worldly life, in his relations with others. But now the context is much broader and wider. The way to work for what is best is to take the hereafter into account. That was a rupture or reform that the Quran introduced into the old Arabic way of thinking. These type of sayings were integral to a variety of genres. Hikam, wise sayings; wasaya, wisdom testaments, father to son, tribal chief to his people; mawa'iz, warnings, kind of instructions that are full of prohibitive things, as well as encouragement to good things. And then, of course, the very important field of ethics, so-called akhlaq, the emphasis on the virtuous character traits. And the principle of reason was taken to be Amir Junudihi, the commander of his troops, the chief trait, the leading trait, under which all the other moral traits would be assembled and guided. So we have this wide field of literature where many of these early utterances have been recorded. Many of them were placed into the mouth of the Prophet, and there's no reason to think that Muhammad wouldn't have repeated many of these. Many of them are attributed to famous early Muslim personalities, the companions or their disciples, the successors. Many of them also go back to pre-Islamic figures, either biblical prophets, David, Solomon figure prominently in this, but also some pre-Islamic Arab figures that are not known outside of the Islamic tradition, like Luqman, who was either a Yemeni or Ethiopian sage, and whose wisdom is very similar to Ahiqar and has parallels to Aesop as well. They all assume that the inborn virtue or innate talent of intelligence, reason, is something that was created in the human constitution by God and is apportioned and allotted in varying amounts among people. Therefore, we all vary in the amount of innate intelligence provided with us as a gift from the beginning. Anyone who has children will have remarked to themselves why one child seems to be more intelligent or smart or superlative in one discipline, and another child has less of that capacity but is favored in another way. One child is good in math, the other in music, whatever. The old Arabs and the early Muslims had pondered on these disparities and understood and explained them as differences in what God had provided each individual in terms of these innate faculties. There is a very famous creation narrative which has become quite controversial. In fact, it became very notorious and controversial early on in Islamic thought. In 1908, a Hungarian Jewish savant, Ignaz Zahir, published a famous article called Neoplatonic and Gnostic Elements in Hadith. And he identified this class of sayings. The saying goes, as you see on page 3, number 4. When God created the intelligence, لما خلق الله العقل, he said to it, face forward, or come near, and it drew near. And then he commanded it, face back, or turn your face back, and it withdrew, or it turned its face back. And then he swore in an oath, by my power and my glory, and he proceeded to eulogize it. You are the best creature I ever created, and the dearest to me. And then it finally ends with a series of statements which deal with reward and punishment. By means of thee I receive, by means of thee I bestow, or by means of thee I reward, and by means of thee I punish. And this statement has been the subject of a fierce controversy for centuries among Muslim authorities. Goldzahir fastened on it and said, although forms of this narrative attributed to the Prophet Muhammad have the opening phrase, لَمَّا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ, when God created. There are other forms of it in the version, أَوَّلُ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَقْلِ. The first that God created was the intellect, or the intelligence. And Goldzahir said, of course, this is the Neoplatonic intellect, as world soul and first intellect. And later on, in order to mitigate this foreign intrusion into Muslim thought, a borrowing from the Greeks, they had to change the opening phrase to make it more acceptable to Muslim orthodoxy, because it was patently non-Quranic. And so they tampered with it, and even after they had changed its form into when God had created, they still were uneasy with it, and there was this huge debate about whether it was an authentic prophetic utterance or whether it was a forgery which is meant to infiltrate non-Islamic ideas into Islam. And most people have accepted his analysis. Even today, it's widely cited as Goldzahir showed, the Neoplatonic first intellect had been brought into Muslim thought very early on and was the basis of a set of controversial statements. In fact, Goldzahir was reflecting the positivist, rationalist orientation of his age and his era, his generation, late 19th century European positivism. And of course the assumption that the Easterners and the Semites, and especially the Arabs, they don't think elevated thoughts, and anything of profound nature comes from Greece or the West. And of course this way of thinking is still very much alive today, that attributing any of the higher reaches of Muslim thinking and experience to non-Muslim sources is something that is still received in certain circles with a kind of natural ease. Unfortunately, he was incorrect, because it can be demonstrated without too much difficulty that the original form was lemma khalaqa, when God created the inborn human talent of intelligence, reason. And the first evidence for the أول ما خلق, the first that God created was the intellect, comes at least 3.5 centuries after the Prophet's era. And what I had done in my dissertation was to examine all possible versions of this report, which is a much studied hadith and much commented on in the critical literature of Muslim hadith specialists. There are over 30 such narrations with varying chains of transmission. They call it isnad. And if you carefully examine them, you will see that they are early versions of a basic saying. And each version, each relation, each form of the narration has slightly differing wording which could interpret or change the meaning slightly either towards a determinist view or towards a free will and human responsibility view. Now, in the context of early Muslim thought, for the first 150 years, the biggest burning issue of the 2 or 3 main controversial points of dispute was the notion of qadar, or human responsibility for acts. And there was a strong wing, especially based in lower Iraq, that upheld the human responsibility for at least for evil acts. They don't want to saddle God with the burden of having determined our bad acts or acts of disobedience. It might be okay to saddle God with responsibility for our good acts. And people like Hassan al-Basri, a famous early successor who grew up in Medina and was in touch with early companions and died in 110 in Basra, 729 of the Common Era, is one of the main sources for attribution of this hadith through a variety of his disciples, who were all noted for their asceticism as well as for their the so-called Qadr doctrine. Later on, the Mu'tazili, or systematic rationalizing school of theology, the first major theological school actually, which for a brief period in the early 3rd century, 9th century, was actually the official doctrine of the state, promoted by one of the Abbasid caliphs, al-Ma'mun, and enforced through a form of persecution of people who wouldn't accept that kind of teaching. They were also connected in their pedigree with the earlier circles in Iraq who upheld the Qadr doctrine. So if we look carefully at the text of 4, the isnad is given here. This is a little bit of a technical thing, but it comes from a text from Ibn Hanbal's son, who collected his father's hadith material concerning zuhud, self-renunciation or self-denial. And the isnad goes through Hassan al-Basri and reaches, it goes through a series of tradents who are all noted for their qadr affiliation and for their asceticism. The person who in fact reported this from al-Hasan, his name is Malik ibn Dinar. He was a qas, a preacher, public preacher, popular preacher, and a well-known ascetic Qadari proponent. And his pupil, Ja'far ibn Sulaiman al-Dubai, recorded his sayings and his teachings for his master Malik, who in fact was the pupil of Hassan. So many of Malik's utterances are recorded as being derived from Hassan. And what we have is actually a hidden written source, because Ja'far ibn Sulaiman al-Dubai compiled a book called Zuhud Malik ibn Dinar. And much of the Zawaid, additional material in the Kitab al-Zuhud of Ibn Hanbal's son, is derived from this written source, Zuhud Malik ibn Dinar. So we're going back maybe half a century from the date of Ibn Hanbal in the early 3rd century back to the middle or late 2nd century of Islam, and Hassan died in the early 2nd century. Now, it's given as a statement of Hassan, but in the sources it's referred to as having been raised, rafa'a, up to the Prophet. Hassan never met the Prophet. He was born several decades after the Prophet. but it was assumed that Hassan's teaching was authentic and reflected the sentiments and comprehension of the Madani's companions, so that if Hassan said this, it meant that the Prophet probably taught it too. That was the situation in terms of the recording and transmission of this material. So although Hassan did not say that the Prophet uttered it, it was understood by his disciples that Hassan was basically transmitting something that the Prophet would have taught. At least that was the conceit. And later on, with the increasing strictness of methodological transmission of hadith, which insisted on a completed chain of transmitters all the way from persons like Hassan's third generation Muslim up to the Prophet himself, there was a tendency to fill in the blanks and provide the names that should have been there. It was known which companions Hassan had contact with, and those people reported from the Prophet. So if we wanted to know the completed chain, we would fill in some of the names. And then we find this utterance recorded in slightly later versions with a complete isnad back to the Prophet. The hadith critics, of course, the Sunni Ashab al-Hadith, would have seized upon this as a sleight of hand. They call it tadlis, deceit. The Prophet did not say this. Hassan said it. But then you're attributing it to the Prophet. This is called a lie in technical terminology. The Prophet did not utter this. Furthermore, they had a reason to attack this type of hadith because it was one of a class of sayings that is in the genre of fadl al-aql, in praise of intelligence, reason. And the people who praised intelligence and reason were the people who upheld the qadr doctrine, which essentially later had been declared by the mainstream Sunni traditionalist authorities as an unapproved or illegitimate doctrine, which was not to be upheld as good teaching, especially because the Mu'tazilites, who were condemned later, had made aql, reason, central to their theology, particularly in terms of their teaching on moral obligation. God cannot impose obligations and requirements on humans without providing them with the necessary intelligence to comprehend and act on His bidding. And otherwise it would be unjust. And God is not just, as the Mu'tazila would have said. God does not tie our hands and legs and throw us into the ocean and command us to swim. He provides us some means to keep our head above the water.